Close your eyes right now. Not a slow blink, not a rest between blinks. Close them and keep them closed while you keep listening. Let your spine stay upright, shoulders where they already are, jaw loose enough that your teeth stop touching. Notice the first thing that happens, which is not darkness. It is a kind of red-brown static, a low field of moving color your retina keeps producing even with no light to catch. Give it 3 seconds and the static will start to settle. Notice your ears doing something they were not doing a moment ago, reaching further into the room, catching a hum, a fabric shift, your own breath moving through your nose in a way you could see a second ago and now can only feel. Keep your eyes closed. Let your eyelids carry their actual weight instead of holding it up out of habit. Stay here. You are not resting yet. You are just arriving. Here is the part that does not add up. What you just did took no muscle beyond 2 small ones in your eyelids. It burned less energy than typing this sentence would, and yet inside your skull, within the first 2 seconds, your brain's electrical output changed shape in a way that shows up clearly on a scalp recording. A shift larger than the one produced by several minutes of solving a math problem with your eyes open. A gesture with almost no physical cost produced a jump in neural organization that effortful thinking does not reliably produce. Closing your eyes is not nothing. It is closer to flipping a switch that most of your waking hours never touch, so the question sits there, unresolved for now. How does removing information generate more order in the brain than receiving it does? If that question is already pulling at you, stay with it, because the answer arrives in layers. Subscribe and tap the like button now if you want every layer of this series delivered the moment it is finished, since this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of small, disproportionate mechanism. To understand why closing your eyes does anything at all, you have to understand what you are actually shutting off, and it is bigger than most people assume. Your retina is not a lens cap, it is nervous tissue, technically part of your brain that grew outward during development and ended up sitting at the back of your eye. Meaning when you close your eyelids, you are not covering a camera, you are gating an extension of your central nervous system. From there, roughly 1 million axons per eye, bundled into your optic nerve, a cable about the width of a pencil, carry signal back toward your skull. That signal does not go straight to a single vision center. It fans out to more than 30 distinct, separately mapped processing zones across your occipital, temporal, and parietal cortex. A wiring diagram formalized by neuroanatomists David Van Essen and Daniel Fellman in the 1990s. Each zone tuned to something specific. One for edges, one for motion, one for faces, one for the exact tilt of a line. Altogether, vision claims something close to 1/3 of the entire processing territory of your cortex. More real estate than any other single sense gets. A border-to-border occupation most people never think about because it runs invisibly, underneath the picture it produces. Around that cable sits a smaller, easily overlooked piece of machinery, the orbicularis oculi, a ring of muscle circling each eye socket, thin enough to close your eyelids in under 1/10 of a second. Faster than almost any other voluntary muscle contraction in your body performs its job. Underneath the lids, a tear film barely thicker than a sheet of paper keeps the cornea moist and optically clear, a film that gets redistributed and refreshed the instant your eyes close, meaning even the surface tissue of your eye gets a kind of maintenance pass during the very seconds your cortex begins its own. Here is the fact almost nobody carries around. Your visual cortex is not a passive screen waiting for light to arrive and paint it. It is closer to a forecasting system that is already predicting what the next frame of the world will look like before the light lands, a model built from decades of pattern, constantly checking incoming photons against its own guess, and only bothering to update loudly when the guess is wrong. This idea, formalized by neuroscientist Carl Friston under the name predictive processing, flips the old assumption people still walk around with, the belief that eyes are cameras and the brain is a recording device. The science says almost the opposite. Your brain spends more energy predicting the image than registering it. Every time you look at a familiar room, you are seeing mostly your own forecast, lightly corrected by reality. An act of continuous authorship your visual system performs so smoothly, you mistake it for simple observation. Most people, asked to describe what their eyes do, will say something close to recording, a lens taking in a scene exactly as it exists. The actual division of labor runs closer to the reverse, with the majority of the work happening before any light lands, and only a thin correction layer added afterward, a ratio almost nobody guesses correctly the first time they hear it. The number worth sitting with is this: of roughly 200 million neurons folded into your occipital lobe, the majority stay engaged in some form of predictive vigilance across every waking hour you keep your eyes open, whether you are reading, walking, or staring at a static wall. Because even a static wall requires the forecasting system to keep confirming that nothing has changed. That confirmation is not free. It draws glucose, it draws oxygen, and it draws attention away from any competing internal process, in the same way a factory floor kept running at full capacity, even during a slow shift, still burns the same electricity a busy shift would. Which means when you close your eyes, you are not turning off a passive intake pipe. You are pulling the plug on a third of your cortex's most demanding, most constantly running forecasting operation, a system that under open eyes never fully rests, not during a walk, not during a conversation, not while you read a menu, because it is always predicting, always correcting, always burning fuel to keep the model current. 30 processing zones, a 1 million fiber cable per side, roughly 200 million neurons, a third of your cortical map running from the second you wake until the second you sleep. And almost none of that machinery gets an intentional break unless you physically block the light with 2 thin folds of skin. That is the anatomy underneath the gesture. Everything that happens next in this video is what occurs the instant that machinery is finally allowed to stand down. The first layer happens faster than you can finish noticing it. The moment your eyelids close, the lateral geniculate nucleus, a small relay station inside your thalamus that normally forwards retinal signal straight to your visual cortex, loses its main input and throttles the amount of information it passes onward. Within roughly 1 to 2 seconds, occipital regions of your cortex begin producing a rhythmic electrical pattern between 8 and 12 cycles per second, known since the 1920s as the alpha rhythm, the very first brainwave ever recorded on a human scalp. On an EEG trace, this shows up as a clean, almost musical waveform rising out of what had been a busier, more irregular signal, a switch from noise to rhythm that a technician can spot without training. This particular rhythm has a specific origin story. German psychiatrist Hans Berger recorded it in 1929 using electrodes taped to his own son's scalp, the first time a human brain's electrical activity had ever been captured outside the skull. And the eyes-closed alpha surge was the very pattern that convinced skeptical colleagues the recording was real because it appeared and vanished so reliably with something as simple as a closed eyelid that no artifact could explain it away. That is layer 1. Input removed, relay throttled, rhythm born, all inside 2 seconds. A signal so consistent it built the entire field of human electroencephalography around it. Layer 2 is where that rhythm stops being a byproduct and starts doing work. Alpha oscillations are not simply what idle cortex looks like. They function as a gating mechanism, a kind of traffic signal that controls which regions of your brain get access to processing resources at any given instant. Austrian neuroscientist Wolfgang Klimisch, working out of the University of Salzburg, spent decades mapping this relationship and found something that runs against intuition. Alpha power rises specifically in regions that need to be inhibited so that other regions can work with less interference, meaning the eyes-closed alpha surge in your occipital cortex is your brain actively quieting its most demanding sensory channel to free up bandwidth elsewhere. A kind of internal reallocation that Klimisch describes functioning less like sleep and more like selective silencing, a spotlight operator dimming one stage so another can be seen. This is not your brain going quiet. It is your brain getting selectively loud somewhere else by first going deliberately quiet here. Klimisch's recordings also show the rhythm is not uniform across the whole occipital sheet. It is strongest exactly over the zones carrying the heaviest predictive load moments earlier, meaning the quieting is targeted, not blanket. Your brain choosing precisely where to loosen its grip first. His later comparisons across individuals even found that people with a naturally faster resting alpha frequency tend to show quicker recovery from mental fatigue, suggesting the rhythm is not just a marker of rest, but a working part of how efficiently a given brain can shift states at all. Layer 3 is the one almost nobody expects, because it is not really about vision anymore. As occipital alpha rises and visual processing load drops toward its floor, a separate, distributed set of regions increases its coordination. Medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and precuneus, a network first formally described by neurologist Marcus Raschel and colleagues at Washington University School of Medicine in a landmark 2001 paper, who named it the default mode network because it appears to switch on by default whenever external task demand drops. This is the circuitry active during autobiographical memory, moral reasoning, imagining the future, and the loose, undirected thinking people call mind-wandering. Rachel's team showed this network is not dormant tissue waiting for nothing to happen. It consumes a disproportionate share of your brain's resting energy budget, and it becomes measurably more coordinated within the same short window that your occipital alpha rises. Rachel's later work went further, showing this network's resting energy draw accounts for a strikingly large share of your brain's total metabolic budget, comparable to what task-focused thinking consumes, which upended an older assumption that a brain doing nothing was a brain barely spending anything. Close your eyes for 60 seconds, and you are not just quieting one channel, you are handing a second, deeper thinking system the bandwidth that channel just gave back. A handoff your brain performs automatically, with no instruction from you, beyond the closing of 2 eyelids. Consider what a technology company would need to build to reproduce even the first layer of this on purpose. A system that senses when a sensory channel is unnecessary, throttles that specific channel's bandwidth in under 2 seconds, reallocates the freed capacity toward background processes, and does this without a central command issuing an instruction, would require dedicated firmware, dozens of sensors, and constant power. Telecom engineers spend years designing adaptive bandwidth allocation systems for data networks that do a rough version of exactly this, dynamically throttling one channel to protect another. And those systems need server racks, cooling budgets, and maintenance contracts running around the clock. A data center performing this kind of dynamic reallocation at scale can draw enough electricity to power a small town. Your thalamus does the equivalent gating in a single synaptic delay, using no battery beyond what a resting neuron already draws, every single time you lower 2 thin folds of skin, a piece of infrastructure no engineering budget has ever matched for cost per operation. None of this stays contained to the 60 seconds it happens in. Modern daylight for most adults is screen light, a phone within reach from the moment you wake, a monitor for 8 or more hours, a television or a second phone in the evening, meaning the specific gesture of fully closing your eyes for any sustained stretch while awake has, for a large share of adults, nearly disappeared from a normal day outside of sleep. Your occipital cortex, under this pattern, spends the entire waking day running its predictive machinery near full load, rarely dropping into the alpha-dominant resource-releasing state described above, because the eyelids that would trigger it almost never come down long enough. Over months of that pattern, researchers studying alpha activity and sustained attention have linked a chronically suppressed alpha baseline to a specific, familiar complaint: a tired, foggy, low-focus feeling that shows up even after a full night of sleep, the kind of fatigue people usually blame on poor rest, low iron, or too much coffee, when a meaningful part of it may be a visual system that has not been given a lawful reason to stand down in weeks. Two symptoms line up here that most people never connect to each other. The first is that afternoon fog, the sense of being simultaneously wired and exhausted, often blamed on blood sugar or bad sleep the night before, when the more consistent variable across days is actually screen-continuous open-eye time, not sleep duration. The second is a thinner, harder-to-reach version of reflective thought, the kind of loose problem-solving or memory retrieval that used to arrive easily during a shower or a walk and now feels sluggish, which lines up with a default mode network that rarely gets the resource handoff described in the mechanism above, because the channel that normally funds it is never released. Reformulate the common belief, and you get something closer to the mechanism. Tiredness is not always a lack of energy. Sometimes it is a channel that never got permission to close. People chase the fatigue with caffeine, aimed at the wrong system because the missing ingredient was never stimulation. It was 60 seconds of subtraction, repeated across a day that currently allows 0. This is a different ledger than sleep debt, and worth separating from it clearly. Sleep debt is measured in missing hours of a state your body enters once a night. What accumulates here is different. Hundreds of missing 60-second windows across a single week, each one a small, repeatable release valve your open-eyed hours never got to use. A deficit that does not show up on a sleep tracker at all because the tracker only watches the one long nightly window, not the dozens of brief ones that used to punctuate an ordinary day. Stretch this pattern out across years rather than weeks, and the picture gets sharper. An adult whose waking eyes rarely close outside of sleep spends conservatively 16 hours a day funding a predictive system that a single generation ago would have been granted dozens of brief, unscheduled pauses across an ordinary day, standing in a field, sitting by a window, waiting without a screen in hand. Remove those pauses for years, and what accumulates is not damage in the dramatic sense. It is a shifted baseline, an attentional floor that sits permanently higher than it used to, so that the fog people now consider normal by mid-afternoon is, mechanistically, a system that has forgotten what a released state even feels like. If a third of your cortex quietly running unpaid sounds like something worth knowing more about, this channel breaks down one more of these mechanisms every episode. So hit subscribe and leave the video a like before the next layer of this starts, since where this goes next connects to a part of your nervous system almost nobody associates with vision at all. If you want to see how far past vision this actually reaches, look at what shifts elsewhere in your body. During the same eyes-closed window studies, we're measuring alpha in. Heart rate variability, a marker of how flexibly your autonomic nervous system can shift between alert and calm states, tends to rise modestly during sustained eyes-closed rest compared with eyes-open baseline, a shift consistent with reduced sympathetic vigilance, because a meaningful share of your baseline alertness is visually driven, your nervous system staying slightly more on guard, specifically because it is scanning a visual field for anything that changes. Remove the field, and part of that background vigilance has nothing left to monitor, so it stands down too. Your vestibular system, the balance sensing apparatus in your inner ear, also recalibrates slightly differently with eyes closed, since it can no longer cross-check its motion signal against a visual horizon and has to trust its own inertial sensing alone for a moment. A brief, low-stakes exercise in a circuit that otherwise leans on vision as a crutch. The way a hiker who has always used a map slowly learns to trust the terrain underfoot when the map is finally folded away. Push the lens back further, and the evolutionary logic gets easier to see. Sustained visual monitoring of the environment is, biologically, a vigilance behavior, the posture of an animal checking for predators, threats, or prey. Voluntarily closing the eyes in a given environment is a signal your nervous system reads as a declaration of safety, a green light that tells downstream systems it is acceptable to redirect resources away from external scanning and toward internal maintenance. Memory consolidation, emotional processing, tissue-level repair signaling. Every mammal that sleeps performs a version of this, but the eyes-closed state while still awake is its own separate category, one that human ancestors likely experienced constantly and without effort, sitting near a fire, resting in shade at midday, waiting without a task in a way modern schedules rarely allow. This is not a wellness trick borrowed from a meditation app. It is closer to a default biological setting that a fire-lit, screen-free environment produced automatically, and that a lit, glowing, notification-driven environment has quietly deleted from most adult days. Grazing animals offer an easy comparison, since herbivores that live under constant predation pressure still close their eyes in short bursts throughout a resting period, but only once the herd around them signals enough collective safety to allow it. A behavior researchers studying vigilance in prey species have documented as tightly linked to perceived group protection rather than tiredness alone. Humans carry a version of the same calculation, quietly checking, without ever framing it this way, whether a room feels safe enough to justify closing the eyes at all, which is part of why the gesture feels almost impossible to perform convincingly in a crowded train car and completely natural on a quiet porch. There is a wider frame worth naming here because the eyes closed reflex likely predates almost every other calming behavior your nervous system carries. Long before any of the more elaborate rest states mammals evolved, closing the visual channel was probably one of the earliest ways a nervous system had of telling the rest of the body it was safe enough to lower its guard. A switch simple enough that species with almost no other shared calming behavior still carry some version of it. What you are doing in 60 seconds is not a modern invention layered onto biology. It is closer to the oldest button your nervous system owns. Tell me the exact sound you noticed once your eyes closed and vision stopped competing for your attention. Not whether the exercise worked, but the specific texture of what your ears caught. A hum, a breath, a distant engine, a silence you had not registered until now. Put it in the comments, because the answer says more about your particular environment and your particular nervous system than any study average ever could. The dose that reliably produces the alpha shift described above starts at 60 seconds, though several studies tracking eyes closed resting EEG show the effect deepening and stabilizing somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 full minutes, so 60 seconds is a floor, not a ceiling. Sit or stand with your spine roughly vertical rather than slumped, since a collapsed chest measurably restricts the slow, low breathing pattern that tends to accompany this state. Let your eyelids close without clenching them shut, because visible tension around the eyes and forehead recruits muscle activity that competes with the cortical quieting you are trying to allow, meaning a tightly squeezed eye produces a noisier signal than a softly closed one, a sign the mechanism is active. Somewhere past the 20-second mark, most people notice the visual field static settling into something flatter and darker, alongside an unforced slowing of the breath and a faint heaviness through the face and shoulders, a sensation of the whole system easing its posture rather than holding one. This works seated, standing, or lying down, and for someone who is blind, particularly if the condition is congenital, the visual-specific piece of this mechanism will not apply in the same way, though the vestibular and autonomic components described earlier still can, since those do not depend on the retina at all. If you wear contact lenses or find closing your eyes tightly uncomfortable, a soft, barely sealed closure works just as well as a firm one. The mechanism responds to light exclusion, not to pressure. Two things reliably cancel the effect: reaching for a phone the instant your eyes reopen, which reloads the exact predictive load you just released before it has time to consolidate anything, and performing the gesture in a loud, visually bright, or high-alert environment, since a nervous system that still reads the room as unsafe will not authorize the vigilance drop that makes the alpha rise meaningful in the first place. A third, quieter error is doing this only once and expecting a lasting shift, since the baseline described earlier moves gradually, built from repetition across days, not from a single 60-second pause performed once and forgotten. If your environment is unavoidably loud, cupping your palms lightly over your closed eyes without pressing on the eyeball, or simply turning your face away from the brightest light source in the room, can partially substitute for a quieter setting, since it is the combined removal of visual load and threat cues that produces the shift, not silence alone. There is something almost embarrassing about how little this costs. No equipment, no subscription, no attention span longer than a short elevator ride, and still it reaches into a third of your cortex and asks it to stand down. Still, it hands a deeper, older thinking system the bandwidth it has been quietly starved of for years. We built a species-wide environment optimized for exactly one thing: keeping the eyes open and the visual system fed, screens designed to be looked at, notifications designed to be seen, entire industries measured by how long they can hold your open eyes on a rectangle of light. And in doing that, we removed, almost without noticing, the one input-free minute a day that used to arrive on its own. Before artificial light, before glass rectangles, before anything competed for a gaze, human eyes closed constantly throughout an ordinary day, not as a technique, just as the natural rhythm of a nervous system with nothing urgent to watch. What you practiced in this video is not a hack layered on top of modern life. It is modern life's missing default, restored for 60 seconds. A small return to a setting your biology never stopped expecting, still sitting there, unused, underneath every bright and open-eyed hour you spend without it. Maybe the deeper lesson is not about eyes at all. Maybe every sense you carry has its own version of this same missing minute, its own third of your cortex, quietly running at full load with no scheduled release. And closing your eyes is simply the one version simple enough to notice because it happens to have a visible switch built from two folds of skin. The others, the ones tied to sound, to constant low-grade touch, to the endless small decisions a crowded environment demands, may be waiting for a switch nobody has found yet, still costing you a third of something, still unpaid.